The South Carolina Gamecocks are officially back in the Final Four, making this one of the best coaching jobs of Don Staley's career.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I am Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and you can also find my written work over on Gamecock Digest on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's episode is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. The South Carolina Gamecocks defeated the Oregon State Beavers on Easter Sunday afternoon and are officially heading back to their fourth straight Final Four and their sixth overall in program history. And it got me thinking a little bit about just what Don Staley has done with this team this year, because honestly, y'all, considering the circumstances, objectively speaking, it is remarkable what Don Staley has accomplished with this group, to the point where I'm willing to say that this is by far one of the better coaching jobs that she has sort of done in her coaching career. And I think it even rivals what she did with the Freshies back in the 2019 through 20 season. So before we get into that part of the conversation, let's talk about just what all South Carolina had to deal with going into this season. We all know at this point what South Carolina lost from last year's Final Four team, losing 8 players overall on the roster, including 7 seniors or graduate players. 5 players wound up getting drafted to the WNBA. 3 of them were first rounders, including the number 1 overall pick in Aaliyah Boston. And South Carolina also literally lost their entire starting lineup. Now, in modern collegiate athletics, when a team goes through a situation like this, for the most part, you would probably assume that a lot of coaches would be diving headfirst to the transfer portal, trying to get several players from all across the country to try to throw together basically a hodgepodge of a team that's full of juniors and seniors to try to offset what you had just lost. And South Carolina didn't really do that. Yes, they did attempt to go after several players in the portal, and Anissa Morrow was one of them who wound up going to LSU. But the Gamecocks did wind up only getting one transfer, and that was Tahina Paopao from Oregon, of course. So Don Staley, for the most part, decided that, in this past offseason, she was going to ride with the high school class she had coming in and the players that she already had on her roster. And again, for good reason. I mean, you go to 3 straight Final Fours, you don't really need to have to change a whole lot in terms of your program blueprint. But when you don't have much continuity in your starting lineup, it can create a lot of problems. And you throw in the fact that South Carolina had to play, I believe, 6 top 25 teams during the regular season, and then another one, the conference tournament. And then they played Indiana and Oregon State this past weekend, 2 more top 25 teams. You would think that somewhere, at least in those 9 games, South Carolina would have dropped at least a couple. And they didn't drop a single one. They didn't drop any game, for that matter, this whole season, going to the Final Four undefeated for the second straight year in a row. I don't think there is another coach in women's college basketball that can endure the losses from a personnel standpoint that South Carolina endured this past offseason and wind up right back in the Final Four without a single blemish on their resume. It is, again, remarkable what Don Staley's done with this year's group. Now, when we compare this to the 2019 through 20 season, the first year that the renowned Freshies group was here in Columbia, obviously, the motivation going into that season was a little bit different. South Carolina, sure, they were still a pretty good program back then, but they weren't exactly the South Carolina that everyone knows them to be now. And Dawn Staley, that offseason, going into the 2019 through 20 season, she had to make a lot of changes to the program. If we all recall, the 2018 through 19 season wasn't a good year. I think South Carolina actually had double-digit losses that season, which now would seem almost unfathomable, but it wasn't long ago where that was taking place. And part of that was because, quite frankly, the culture was a little bit more toxic in the locker room, at least for that particular season. There were a couple of players that I know some of you diehard Gamecock women's basketball fans can recall that probably were not the best for the culture in that locker room for that team. And so some people had to be asked, quite frankly, to walk out the door. And Dawn Staley realized that she needed to basically overhaul the roster and she needed to infuse new life into her program. And so she got the best high school recruiting class in the country for the upcoming season. And she had to replace 3 starters, not the entire starting lineup like this year's team, but still good chunk of your production. And Dawn Staley wound up starting 3 true freshmen in that season in Aaliyah Boston, Bree Beal, and Zaya Cook. And the other thing that was just unreal when looking back at that season, South Carolina played 14 games against top 25 teams, 14 of them. That is 5 more than this year's group has had to play. Oh, and by the way, this was unfortunately the season when COVID derailed the entire NCAA tournament. And so South Carolina never even got a chance to play for a national championship that year. Likely would have been maybe against an Oregon in the national title game if that had taken place. But South Carolina won every single one of those games except for just one. And again, they were starting 3 true freshmen in their lineup that season. So when you compare both of these seasons, Dawn Staley had motivation that year to try to correct what all had gone wrong the previous year in the locker room and on the court. And then going to this season, Dawn Staley had motivation to try to get back to the Final Four. She admitted finally in the press conference after the Gamecocks defeated Oregon State on Sunday that it ate her up what happened in last year's Final Four, because she talked about how that group went about everything the right way, did all the things that they needed to do and wanted to do in order to win another national championship, and they just were not able to get it done. And that haunted her for a little while and probably has continued to haunt her throughout the offseason, maybe even going into this year. And so obviously, when something like that happens to you, whether you're a coach or a player, it just adds more fuel to your fire to want to get back to that same exact spot the next time around, although that time you want to come out on top instead of coming out the loser. And so I don't think it quite tops what Dawn Staley did with the Freshies in the 2019 through 20 season, but I think it's pretty doggone close. I don't think that you can just argue above and beyond that what Dawn Staley did 5 years ago was her best coaching job over what she did this year. I think that they are both special in their own way. But if I had to give a nod to one of the two, I have to give the nod to what Dawn Staley did in the 2019 through 20 season in regards to her best coaching job in her career at South Carolina. And of course, if you disagree with me, let me know in the comments section on YouTube or shoot me a message if you're listening to this on an audio podcast app. Now, talking about what South Carolina did this past weekend, there's one particular player that stood out to me in terms of what her role has become at this point in the season and just how reliable she is for how inexperienced she is in this situation. I'm going to talk about that player in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by GameTime. GameTime is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the GameTime app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. You can save up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets for games at the ballpark. The Atlanta Braves are going to begin their home slate in the 2024 season this coming Friday evening when they take on the reigning defending NL pennant champs in the Arizona Diamondbacks. That game will be taking place at 7:20 p.m. Eastern time. And the cheapest ticket you can get right now for that game is $50 in general admission. Not bad for a home opener for a team as good as the Atlanta Braves in Major League Baseball. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download the GameTime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Welcome back to this Monday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. Let's talk about Tessa Johnson, because when you look at this basketball team, again, everybody knows who Camila Cardoso is from a national standpoint. And then obviously, when you talk about maybe the next most popular player, you talk about Mylasia Fulwiley, a superstar potential type true freshman that this team has, and somebody that has been going off for the most part for this team since the postseason began. But one player that quite frankly deserves to be discussed more is Tessa Johnson, the other true freshman guard that South Carolina got in last year's class. Now, the thing about Tessa Johnson is, sure, she might not have the highlight reel type skills that a Mylasia Fulwiley has. She might not be a player that can take over a game like a Camila Cardoso can. But Tessa Johnson, for being a true freshman, she has quickly become a player that Don Staley relies on in close game situations, in late game situations. Look back at this past weekend against Indiana and Oregon State. Out of the 5 players that Don Staley had on the floor, Tessa Johnson was one of them late in both of those games. And those games were close games. It wasn't like South Carolina was up 15 to 20 points in either one of those contests with 5-6 minutes to go. It was, a couple possessions. And so you would think that with the way Don Staley has operated as the Gamecocks head coach for the past several years now, when those kind of games happen, Don Staley has typically leaned on her experienced players, leaned on her upperclassmen to stay on the floor for basically the rest of the game and get the job done because she trusts them the most for obvious reasons. But the past couple games, she is throwing out Tessa Johnson, a true freshman, amongst the rest of that group, amongst Bree Hall and a Camila Cardoso and an Ashlyn Watkins and Raven Johnson. And I think that we need to be taking more note of this because Don Staley doesn't just do that with anybody. Heck, she hasn't done it with Fulwiley every single chance she's gotten over the past few weeks. And again, that's not to take anything away from Mylasia Fulwiley, but what this says about Tessa Johnson is her makeup is just on a different level compared to most other freshmen. And you would expect that for someone who is willing to come to South Carolina and kind of sit behind some players and wait for her opportunity. But Tessa has gone above and beyond in that regard. And the other thing that really gets me about Tessa Johnson is when we look at her game, obviously we all talk about that rainbow arcing shot that she has from behind the three-point line. And sure, that is Tessa Johnson's primary strength. But Tessa Johnson has also shown that if her shot's not falling, or if the Gamecocks maybe are struggling every so often from behind the three-point line, she is willing to drive to the basket, and she's not going to just run in there and throw the ball up and basically hope and pray that the ball's going to go into the hoop. Tessa Johnson also does have a few moves in her arsenal where she'll spin around and fade away from the basket, create some space for herself. You saw her do this against Oregon State. She is a savvy basketball player. And again, she might not have necessarily the speed, just the game-breaking speed that a Fulwiley has, but Tessa Johnson has got a lot up here. And the fact that she is put in these kind of crunch time situations in an NCAA tournament run that the Gamecocks are in the midst of right now, where if a couple plays go the other way, South Carolina could legitimately be going home. And Don Staley is like, I don't care about any of that. I want her out there on the floor. That says a lot. It says a lot. So my point here is this. South Carolina's backcourt is going to be in great shape for the next 3-4 years to come, because next year Raven Johnson, Tahina Paopao will both be back for this team. And then you can assume after next year, it'll likely be Malaysia Fulwiley's time alongside Tessa Johnson at the 2 guard spot. And it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. So just keep an eye out on number 5 for South Carolina in the Final Four, because she might be someone that continues to make big-time plays and get to the free throw line, by the way, and hit clutch free throws to extend a lead. You need those kind of players if you want to win a national championship. South Carolina's got that, not just in their starting lineup, but also with rotational players like Tessa Johnson. So credit to Tessa Johnson for her play this past weekend. And I'm sure that, again, she'll be making more plays when the Gamecocks get to Cleveland later this week. Now, some big news came out on Monday afternoon that doesn't necessarily directly involve South Carolina, but it is going to affect the Gamecocks, as the Tennessee Lady Volunteers have moved on from Kelly Harper and are looking for a new head coach. I'll explain why this is going to impact South Carolina in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV. Fire TV is your destination for sports, from live games to highlights to in-depth analysis. Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as the Fire TV stick that you can plug into your existing TV that provides access to millions of movies and TV episodes, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's opening weekend for baseball or the college basketball tournament, you're going to want to have a Fire TV. Fire TV recently created the Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Fire TV channels let you dive into all the game analysis, highlights, and more to keep up to date on all the latest in the world of sports, from March Madness, the NBA, MLB, and lots more. Not to mention great news, entertainment, gaming, travel, and cooking videos as well. Check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. Trust me on this. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. So big news coming out of the SEC on Monday afternoon, as the Tennessee Lady Volunteers are moving on from head coach Kelly Harper. Now, I know what you might be wondering, Andrew, why are we talking about this on a South Carolina Gamecock-based podcast? This has nothing to do with South Carolina. And sure, from a direct standpoint, it might not impact South Carolina, but Gamecock women's basketball fans should pay attention to this job opening, because, listen, I know that this has been South Carolina's league now for the better part of a decade. And right now, the biggest challenger to South Carolina in this conference, it's not Tennessee. It's the LSU Tigers with Kim Mulkey coaching their squad. But there is no denying that no matter what has happened since the late, great Pat Summitt had to leave the game due to complications from Alzheimer's, that Tennessee is still a top 5 program in women's college basketball in terms of fan support, in terms of the brand that they have, and obviously in terms of historical success. You still cannot snub your nose at Tennessee. You can't. So my point with all this is that this is going to attract a lot of names. Tennessee is a big job, and so there are going to be some big names that are going to be attached to this job. Names of coaches that maybe been to the Final Four a couple times. I expect Tennessee to swing big here, and quite frankly, they should. That is a program that should be contending to go to the Final Four every year and contending to try to win a national title at least every other year. That should be the mark of that program, and it just hasn't been that way for the past 12, 14 years. Coach Yo at Ole Miss, I would not be stunned if her name comes up in this search as a potential interest, as a potential candidate of interest, I should say. Coach Yo has always had great things to say about Tennessee and South Carolina, but she's always been complimentary of both programs. And it would not stun me if Coach Yo decides to go to a program where, listen, if she goes to Tennessee, the fan support is going to be there. She's going to have better access to resources, facilities, And quite frankly, a much easier time trying to build up a roster. She's done great things at Ole Miss, but we all know this. Ole Miss is not a perennial power women's college basketball. Imagine what Coach Yo could do at a place like Tennessee. She could become a consistent Final Four coach if she goes to a place like that. So Coach Yo is someone to watch for. And overall, I think that Tennessee's biggest issue the past couple years has been that they have stuck with the Pat Summitt tree. And I get it. When you have a coach that's been that successful for that long, you want to try to not stray away too far from what has worked for you for such a long period of time. So I believe that they hired, I want to say it was Holly Warlick, who was a former assistant under Pat Summitt when she was at Tennessee. She didn't work out. And then they went and got Kelly Harper, who was a head coach and had done her own thing and been successful, but had been a player under Pat Summitt when she was in her college days. And that has not worked out either, at least compared to the standard that they have up there in Knoxville. So I say all that to say it would not stun me at all if Tennessee decides to finally make an external hire and go away from the Pat Summitt tree. Because, listen, you can try all you want with people that are associated with the Pat Summitt name, but they're not Pat Summitt. That's the big mistake Tennessee's administration has made, and it seems like maybe they're going to finally get their act together in that regard. And I'm just saying that as an objective women's college basketball fan. Now, some of you might be wondering, Andrew, do we need to worry about maybe a Jude Law being looked at by Tennessee? I think the answer is no. I think that Law is quite happy here at South Carolina. I don't think that she's been a head coach very long in her career. She may have had previous head coaching stops, but my point here is I don't think she has the desire to suddenly become a head coach in a sport where right now, again, it is a lot tougher than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago. And she's not going to probably take over a program like a South Carolina. Could she get a look at Tennessee? I guess she could, but I just don't see it happening. And again, she would be a part of sort of that Pat Summitt tree in terms of her former assistants and then her being an assistant under a former assistant. You get where I'm going with all that. So I don't think Gamecock fans have to worry about that. But look, if Tennessee makes the correct hire this time around, South Carolina's going to have more competition in the SEC and from a national championship standpoint moving forward. So right now, I get it. South Carolina fans, you might not be worried about Tennessee a whole heck of a lot. But this year, to be fair to Tennessee, they're one of the tougher outs for South Carolina. 3 games, they were in it going all the way into the fourth quarter. And that was with Kelly Harper as their coach and really, truthfully, only one game-breaking player in Rakia Jackson on their squad. Imagine if they upgrade the talent level and they get a better in-game coach than Kelly Harper. Tennessee will become quite dangerous again. And it won't just be South Carolina, LSU. It'll be South Carolina, LSU, and Tennessee. You look at what Coach Yo's done at Ole Miss. If she stays there and she doesn't leave for Tennessee, you can't overlook them. And then you look at Kenny Brooks going from Virginia Tech to Kentucky. Y'all, this conference is becoming much tougher already. That's not even including Vic Schaefer coming back to the league with Texas this offseason. So you throw in maybe a good coach, someone that can actually elevate Tennessee back to national prominence and going back to the Final Four every year. Y'all, it will make things even more difficult for South Carolina. And listen, don't misconstrue what I'm saying. I'm not saying now, oh no, South Carolina is now going to just go on a nosedive and they're no longer going to be the top dogs in the SEC. Not saying that. Until someone proves otherwise, South Carolina is still the top team in this conference for the foreseeable future. But you should watch this job opening and the search subsequently over the next couple of weeks to see what Tennessee decides to do here with their vacant head coaching position. With that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Hope that y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show. As always, what are y'all's thoughts on the coaching job that Dawn Staley has done here this season with this specific team and how it compares to the team with the freshies back in the 2019 through 20 season? What are your thoughts on Tessa Johnson and how reliable she's become for this team in crunch time situations throughout the NCAA tournament? And lastly, what are your opinions on Tennessee's job now being open and maybe some coaches they could go after and how it could affect South Carolina's standing in the conference in the next couple of years? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section. If you watch today's show on YouTube, or you could shoot me a direct message on X at @ALion_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. As always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Monday and a fantastic start to the work week. And I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.